All right, hello, my fellow risers. So we're doing the philosophy of psychology per Dr. Maria Schachtman's recommendation. She said she'd like to know what I think. Hell yeah! So we're good. We're starting it. 2026 Alpha '07 Charlie. Excellent. All right, so we've got the contents here. Um, so I think what we're gonna do is try to get through the introduction, and then I gotta walk the dogs and go grocery shopping. So the chapters are introduction, rationality, self-knowledge, duality, moral judgment, moral motivation and behavior, free will and responsibility, delusion and confabulation, autism and psychopathy. Pretty cool, huh? So basically, we have to finish this in a week, 7 days. Okay, so we have 7 days to read this. And then conclusion. Did I say conclusion? Okie dokie. So that means that we actually really should try to read, like, well, so that's like 35 pages, like 38, 37 pages. What is this not on? It's not on. Anyway, yeah, like 36, 37 pages a day. Okie dokie. Okie dokie. 37 pages, if I move fast, would still take me like 80 minutes. All right, we're gonna try to do 30 to 37 pages. No, we'll go for 30. So that means that we're gonna try to do the introduction and some of rationality. All right, let's. Oh, here are the detailed contents. So in the introduction, we're going to do an overview. We're going to, I guess, define philosophy of psychology, evaluating psychological studies for the resources questions. And then we're going to try to make it up to, we'll go page 31. So we're going to read the introduction to rationality, clarifying rationality, systematic biases and errors, and pessimism about rationality. I would consider myself a pessimist, but a lot of people that about rationality, but a lot of people that I respect discourage that, including Kahneman. So we'll see what they have to say. Um, I mean, I just don't really hear people who are more pessimistic than I am. So I was about to say like, maybe Kahneman and people are responding to people who are more pessimistic than I am because I'm not. I don't think I'm super pessimistic. I think pure rationality is nonsense. You would have to already have all the rules of interpretation calibrated, um, including for like novel stimuli, um, and a perfect ability to sort of not only perfectly manage the information, but manage all information that is received, not that exists. Um, hmm. Pink poop. Nice. Hello. Um, so anyway, we'll see. Um, and then the next section is objections to pessimism. See that? Okay, let's hit it. You ready, Zamari? All right. We're probably gonna skip the acknowledgments. Let's jump right into the introduction. All right, excellent. So, Do you get anything out of being able to see the page? I bet you can read the word introduction, but can you read anything else? Oh, I don't want to move this. I guess more like that. Okay. Okay. An overview. This book introduces and explains some central issues in the philosophy of psychology. It is important to note that it is not a neutral introduction to the topic. It is an opinionated introduction to the philosophy of psychology in which we defend a particular view of human cognition and agency. I wonder what that view is. The view that we defend is that human cognition and agency are imperfect. Okay, so far so good. In the sense that humans fail to meet some ideal standards of cognition and agency, such as the ideal of rationality, self-knowledge, and free and responsible agency. All right, sweet. So imperfect, fail to meet some ideal standards. Imagine that Lucy wants to pass her ballet exam tomorrow, and she knows that she needs to rehearse the opening routine to make sure she remembers all the steps. But Lucy doesn't do it. Passing the exam is important to her, and she would be very disappointed if she failed. Yet, she sits on the sofa to watch a movie instead of practicing her routine. Given Lucy's goal, passing the ballet exam tomorrow, I'm going to try not to speak too much, but I know I always say that and then fail. Well, there you go. Humans fail to meet some ideal standards of cognition and agency, definitely. Anyway, but maybe I'll try to just keep it short, whatever I say. So anyway, Lucy is not a singular thing, right? A person has many pieces, and even the cognitive person has many pieces, and so she also has a goal of relaxing. She also has a goal of being entertained. Now, verbally, she may deny that goal. She probably underestimates the role of that goal in her cognition. But there are parts of the cognitive system that have that for a goal. Given Lucy's goal, passing the ballet exam tomorrow, her behavior, watching a movie instead of practicing, may be considered irrational, since she does not take the appropriate steps to fulfill her goal. Chapter 1 discusses various notions of rationality and some ways in which human agents might fall short of the standards of rationality. Now, imagine that Giorgio, or maybe say Giorgio, describes himself as an exceptionally generous child, always willing to support his friends. However, that is now not how his friends describe him. On a number of occasions, they have observed that Giorgio has put his own needs before theirs and has So is it useful if I desk portrait and then I can just like move it over each time? I'm not gonna move it so you always see the bottom of the page. That you're just gonna have to miss out on, I think. So that's like a nice size, isn't it? Can someone tell me if that's a nice size? Or if it can even go like significantly smaller or what? Okay, so on a number of occasions, they have observed that Giorgio has put his own needs before theirs and refrained from sharing snacks or helping them with their homework. They think of him as mean and selfish. If Giorgio's friends are right, then we can say that Giorgio lacks self-knowledge. In other words, he does not have an accurate representation of himself. Why would he? How do we write why? Why? I think it's something like that. Why he would do. I think tomorrow I'm gonna put up my language up there. So that's gonna be something that will come up in this stream. In other words, oh, you gotta put a little dot because that's a question, And then you put 2 dots. It's an open-ended question. Okay, anyway. If Giorgio's friends are right, then we can say that Giorgio lacks self-knowledge. In other words, he does not have an accurate representation of himself. In particular, he attributes to himself qualities such as generosity that he does not have. Chapter 2 discusses several ways in which self-knowledge can fail. Finally, imagine Elsa, who is a white US citizen, thinks of herself as a very egalitarian person who respects everybody and considers them all equal, of course, obviously, independently of ethnic origin or skin color. However, when she goes to work, she avoids sitting next to Asian passengers on the bus, and when she talks to her colleagues at work, she tends to ignore her Nigerian secretary. But that's because she's a secretary. I didn't say all people are equal independent of their roles in society. Elsa does not have explicit beliefs that are prejudiced against people who look different from her. Explicit as in like endorsed by her. But behaves in ways that are inconsistent with her explicit beliefs and values. She is vulnerable to implicit biases for which she may or may not be responsible. Hopefully they'll tackle that. Chapter 3 deals with the duality of states and attitudes, and Chapter 6 with the question whether people are responsible for their implicit biases. Perfect. You may have experienced similar failures of rationality and self-knowledge and have encountered biases in yourselves and others. You can come up with your own examples of how human agents are imperfect. Indeed, the view that human cognition... I can do that right, of course. Indeed, the view that human cognition and agency are imperfect is not surprising. Not many philosophers are convinced that humans are perfect agents who are ideally rational, have complete self-knowledge, and behave in unbiased ways. However, this book does not just claim that human cognition and agency are limited on the basis of relevant psychological studies. It also makes some potentially surprising and controversial claims about the extent to which and the reasons why human cognition and agency are limited. In this context, imperfect does not mean stupid or dumb. Great, yeah, because that's what I was thinking. More pessimistic than I would say that. Well, I do say that we're stupid, but it's more of a way of speaking, trying to get you, trying to pull hard against your commitment to human sentience and intelligence and rationality and stuff. Um, Anyway, in this context, imperfect does not mean stupid or dumb. It means that performance. Yeah, I say that we're stupid all the time. That's true. That's true. That's true. That's true. But hopefully now I've explained, given that some explain the subtleties of that. In this context, imperfect does not mean stupid or dumb. It means that performance falls short of the ideal standards that apply to it. Okay, and what I mean when I say stupid or dumb is that we fall dramatically short of what we think we're capable of what we sort of expect of ourselves, or even of, yeah, how we crazily judge ourselves. This book does not advocate an overly pessimistic conception of human cognition and agency. For instance, we do not endorse what John Killstrom, 2004, calls the "people are stupid" school of psychology, which says that humans are fundamentally irrational, that their behavior is automatic and inflexible, and that they are ignorant of what they are doing. I guess I'm somewhere between these authors and Killstrom. Um, Humans are fundamentally irrational. What do we mean by that? I'm not sure. Um, but it sings. Our behavior is automatic. It's not inflexible. And we are ignorant of much or even most of our cognition and most of the reasons for our behavior. Okay. So anyway, but they do not endorse Killstrom. I'm half do. Rather, we advocate a realistic conception that is informed by psychological findings and is defended by philosophical arguments. We resist two extreme views of human cognition and agency. On the one hand, we resist an overly optimistic view according to which human cognition and agency are perfect, or near perfect, with respect to ideal standards such as rationality, self knowledge, and free and responsible agency. Excellent. Wait, what's my symbol for agree? No, it's the symbol for a lira, the Turkish currency. Is that like that? I fucked it up. I think it's something like that. Okay, very good. So that's one. All right, whatever. And then on the other hand, we resist an overly pessimistic view according to which human cognition and agency are hopeless. Okay, yeah, it's not hopeless with respect to these ideal standards. Um, yeah, sorry, we will never achieve those ideal standards. But again, I don't really know what their standards are. So I think I disagree. Our cognition and agency are certainly not perfect. However, by learning about the nature of, extent of, and reasons for their limitations, human agents can improve their performance, for sure. That is one of the reasons why philosophy of psychology is important. It does not simply provide information about what human agents can or cannot do, it offers human agents the resources, so important, the resources to enhance their performance in reasoning, decision making, problem solving, etc., so that they can get closer to the ideal standards, but never meet them. So I think, so I'm excited, because there's a lot that I don't understand, and or that I object to, that Dr. Maria Schechtman says, and she's the one who asked me to read this to see what I think about this. So now I'm really curious what I mean, obviously I've only read like a page, but I was a little bit worried that I would disagree with this as well, and that would be a lot to sift through, to unpack, to sort, to analyze, to a lot of work. So okay, so our cognition and agency are certainly not perfect. However, by learning, oh, okay, right. It does not simply provide information about what human agents can or cannot do, it offers human agents the resources to enhance their performance so that they can get closer to the ideal standards. Let's lean more towards there are things I don't understand with Dr. Schachtman rather than I object to, especially if she sees this. I absolutely take that back. Okay. There is another sense of, until we get close, until we spend more time together, then maybe I'll fess up. There is another sense of imperfection that is addressed in this book. Human cognition and agency can be imperfect in the sense that they are vulnerable to disorders of the mind. Yes, but, okay. Broadly construed, including psychiatric disorders, behavioral anomalies caused by brain damage, developmental disorders, etc. Disorders of the mind are usually identified by behaviors that appear unusual or disadvantageous, right? While it is common to, oh no, I guess, oh right, okay. While it is common to be weak-willed like Lucy, right? That's disadvantageous, but it's common. I see. While it is common to be weak-willed like Lucy, blind to one's own character flaws like Giorgio, or unconsciously biased like Elsa, endorsing wildly implausible beliefs or seeing things that other people cannot see is less common and might lead to the person being diagnosed with a mental disorder. For instance, the mathematician John Nash experienced hallucinations and delusions, coming to believe that aliens were publishing messages in newspapers, which was described in the biographical movie A Beautiful Mind. This book will discuss abnormalities of the mind, including delusion and confabulation, in Chapter 7, and autism and psychopathy in Chapter 8. Thinking about unusual cognitions and behaviors helps us understand how the mind works, including the normal mind, how the mind works, and how vulnerability to disorders of the mind relates to the failure to meet ideal standards. Here are the central questions discussed in the following chapters. Rationality, Chapter 1. Are we rational or irrational? How good are we at reasoning in accordance with the rules of logic and mathematics? How do we reason or make judgments? Do we rely on unreliable heuristics or shortcuts? I'm just going to answer these now. We are irrational. It depends on how important it was to our evolution for the second question of how good are we at reasoning in accordance with the rules of logic and mathematics. So no, we are bad. Um, but if our survival like really depended on it, like we're really good at 1 + 1 is 2. We're really good at if someone dies, then knowing that we have then fewer people. How do we reason or make judgments? Yeah, representations, heuristics. Couldn't answer that quickly. Do we rely on unreliable heuristics or shortcuts? Yes. Okay, chapter 4, not chapter 4, page 4. Oh, we're just continuing. I don't know what just happened. I guess I must be a human brain or something. Next is self-knowledge, which will be chapter 2. Right, that's why I got confused. How well do we know our own mind? All right, hold on. I can put a little title. BRB, Getting the Dogs. Text. No, not free type. Gosh, who was doing all that barking? Add existing, BRB. Gone to. I just put BRB, bro. BRB. Okay. So in chapter 2, we'll talk about how well do we know our own mind? How do we know our mental states? Is the process of knowing our own mental states different in kind from the process of knowing somebody else's mental states? Chapter 3 is going to be duality. Is human reasoning determined by the interaction between two distinct kinds of processes? It's a spectrum. If so, how are these processes different and how do they interact? Why are there only two kinds of processes rather than 3 or 4? You said like emotion and reason? No way. No way he's talking about that. Or they. I don't even know if actually Kengo, I was assuming that was a male name. We know that Lisa is gonna be a female. Kengo, Mm, okay, it's definitely gonna be a male name. Mia. Why is he not coming up? MIYAZONO. Great. Excellent. Oh, this guy's great. Oh, great. Well, I mean, obviously, it's a philosophy of psychology person. I don't know why this is surprising me. I study mind, cognition, and consciousness from a philosophical point of view. Great. Anyway, okay. Um, Chapter 4 will be moral judgment. Are moral judgments based on reasoning or emotion? Maybe maybe that's not going to be as ridiculous as no, I guess they're okay. Or perhaps both. How do moral reasoning and moral emotion interact with one another to produce moral judgments? Chapter 5 will be on moral motivation and behavior. Can we be genuinely altruistic, or are we inevitably selfish? Does empathy cause genuinely altruistic behavior? Does empathy induced behavior have morally desirable consequences? Chapter 6 will be on free will and responsibility. Are we free and responsible agents? No. Is the idea of free will compatible with the empirical findings in psychology and neuroscience? Are we responsible for our implicit biases? Chapter 7, Delusion and Confabulation. Chapter 7, Delusion and Confabulation. How are clinical delusions and confabulations different from everyday irrational beliefs? Different from everyday irrational beliefs. Are delusions more irrational than everyday irrational beliefs? Is the irrationality of delusions different in kind from the irrationality of everyday beliefs? Chapter 8, final chapter, Autism and Psychopathy. What does autism tell us about mind reading capacity and its role in social and communicative activities? What does psychopathy tell us about empathy and its role in moral behavior? Okay, section Philosophy of Psychology. What is philosophy of psychology? We use the term psychology broadly. Psychology, in our sense of the word, includes both psychological disciplines in the narrow sense, includes both psychological disciplines in the narrow sense, such as cognitive psychology, social psychology, developmental psychology, and evolutionary psychology, and research areas in neuroscience and psychiatry. We also use phrases such as psychology and neuroscience or psychology and psychiatry in some contexts to emphasize the relevance of neuroscience or psychology. Psychology, in our sense of the word, is somewhat similar to cognitive science, but the latter typically includes not only psychology and neuroscience, but also artificial intelligence research, linguistics, and anthropology, which will not be discussed in this book. What is philosophy of psychology? Providing a clear definition of philosophy and psychology is challenging, and perhaps not very helpful. Oh, yeah, because by doing it, you're kind of already like making a claim. That's interesting. Like the furthest you can probably go is say it's about like kind of trying to understand what it is and define it and how to talk about it and what it means or something. One thing we can do at this stage, so providing a clear definition of philosophy of psychology is challenging and perhaps not very helpful. One thing we can do at this stage, and perhaps a useful thing to do, is introduce the field of philosophy of psychology with some examples of the questions it asks. Philosophy of psychology is the discipline in philosophy that asks the questions we mentioned above concerning rationality, self-knowledge, free will and responsibility, moral judgment, moral motivation and behavior, and so on. Below, we clarify what philosophy of psychology is by contrasting philosophy of psychology with two related areas of philosophy, philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. And then distinguishing two approaches to the philosophy of psychology. The first approach is mainly concerned with the theoretical and conceptual foundations of psychology, and the second approach is mainly concerned with the implications of psychological studies for philosophically relevant issues. So yeah, I'm more of the second one. Philosophy of psychology and philosophy of mind. Philosophy of psychology can be thought of as a sub-area of philosophy of mind, where philosophy of mind is understood very broadly as the philosophical exploration of the mind. The focus of mainstream philosophy of mind, which is sometimes called metaphysics of mind, has been on metaphysical issues of the mind, including the mind-body problem, mental causation, physicalism, and the nature of consciousness. Philosophy of psychology, in contrast, because that was philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, in contrast, focuses on the kind of issues that are closely related to empirical studies of the mind, or the kind of issues on which we cannot make progress without relevant empirical input. When philosophy of psychology addresses human rationality, for example, it examines the available empirical data to find out whether humans actually reason in accordance with the norms of rationality. Philosophy of psychology and philosophy of science. Philosophy of psychology can also be thought of as a sub-area of philosophy of science, where philosophy of science is understood very broadly as the philosophical exploration of science. Philosophers of science study what a theory is, investigate implications of scientific method, and ask whether scientists make progress. Central issues in philosophy of science, or general philosophy of science, are not essentially connected to a particular scientific field, although many of the traditional issues in philosophy of science are explicitly or implicitly associated with the physical sciences. A recent trend in philosophy of science, however, is the growth and development of those sub-areas that deal with issues that are specific to a particular scientific field. For example, philosophy of biology discusses philosophical issues that emerge from biological studies, e.g., the issues related to adaptationism, the concept of function in biology, the level of selection, etc. Philosophy of psychology is another sub-area that discusses philosophical issues that emerge from psychological studies. Foundational and implicational. We find it useful to divide philosophy of psychology into two sub-areas: foundational philosophy of psychology and implicational. Okay, what's this? And implicational. Oh, this is what they were talking about: theoretical versus like the studies. Foundational philosophy of psychology is concerned with core concepts in psychology, e.g., representation, computation, or concept, and general hypotheses in psychology that can make sense of a series of relevant studies. Okay, so I was wrong. Okay, so foundational philosophy of psychology is concerned with the core concepts in psychology, e.g., representation, computation, or concept, and general hypotheses in psychology that can make sense of a series of relevant studies as interconnected, including the massive modularity hypothesis. I don't know what that is. Which roughly says that our mind is composed of modular systems that are dedicated to some specific tasks. Okay, great. I guess that was obvious. And I accept Fodor's. Let's see, what do they have to say? The language of thought hypothesis, which roughly says that our cognition is based upon processing language-like representations. I'm starting to think that less and less, or I don't know. No, yes, I disagree with that. And the adaptive unconsciousness hypothesis, which roughly says that a part of our mind has evolved via natural selection, and we do not and cannot have direct access to it. Yeah, maybe need some qualifications, but yes. So we'll put a boom. We'll put boom. And we'll put boom. Okay, questions in foundational philosophy of psychology include: what are representations? How does computation work? Is the massive modularity hypothesis plausible? Is the language of thought hypothesis needed to explain cognition? And so on. In contrast, implicational philosophy Implicational philosophy of psychology focuses on the results of particular psychological studies rather than their theoretical foundation. So I was wrong that I was wrong. And investigates. Right, I gotcha. I had misunderstood. Okay, gotcha. In contrast, implicational philosophy of psychology focuses on the results of particular psychological studies rather than their theoretical foundations and investigates their implications for issues that are philosophically relevant. For example, Chapter 1 will focus on a series of influential studies on reasoning biases. Kahneman, Slovic, Tversky, exploring the implications of such studies for questions concerning human rationality. It will ask, for example, whether these studies show that humans are irrational after all. Chapter 7 will discuss studies on the limitations of memory, which show that human agents can easily misremember even important details of past events and thus might have important implications for eyewitness testimony in forensic settings. Sorry, I'm having a thought about my live streaming. Good boy. Just a nice good boy. Cause I guess who's gonna okay, so there's I guess as there are more creators like me live streaming, I mean, then yeah, like, but no, when you're watching live stream, do you really want to be thinking that hard? So do I have to like should I put something on the screen so that you feel like less pressure to like it doesn't feel like school or like work, but can still be stimulating or interesting? We'll think about it. We'll just see what happens. Yeah, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. 'Cause I'm just looking at only one comment. And I'm thinking, I'm just worried about committing to this and just looking fucking stupid when a year from now I still only get. But that's okay. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah. We gotta fuck around and find out. So that's what we're doing. Great. Continuing with the fucking around. Um. So yeah. So does stuff from Kahneman show that humans are irrational after all? Chapter 7 will discuss studies on the limitations of memory, which show that human agents can easily misremember even important details of past events and thus might have important implications for eyewitness testimony, maybe, in forensic settings. One might subsequently ask whether these studies show that eyewitness testimony is fundamentally unreliable. Although we think that the distinction between foundations and implications is useful, we do not assume that it is clear cut. The difference between them is probably a matter of degree. For example, some issues are more foundational and less implicational than others. There will be some borderline cases. For example, the dual process theory, the theory according to which there are two distinct types of cognitive processes, type 1 processes that are fast, unconscious, and automatic, and type 2 processes that are slow, conscious, and controlled. That's so fucking stupid. If he said, it's not him. That is too often how it's defined. And I want to write a paper about this. So that's part of the reason that I've initially reached out to Dr. Schexman. Type 1 processes are fast, less conscious, and less recursive. Okay? Because I do think that it is very useful to talk about type 1 and type 2 processes, system 1 and system 2 processes. But without, we have to excise the ego myth, this idea that there is control. Now, there's more recursive stuff, and you could think of that as control. Like it bounces around to the objectives a bit, right? It's influenced by what the objectives are, by what the goals are in the system. Anyway, so then type 2 processes are slow, um, more likely to be experienced, and more recursive, more feedbacky. Okay? That's how I would define it. Define like this, no, that's stupid to me. So we're gonna put a big fat yod there. Um, gonna put more likely to be experienced. More recursive. More consultation, we can say. More consultation of, how do you do goals? Something like that, maybe. Good. Both are automatic. Okay, both dimensions. And so this is the dual process theory will be discussed in chapter 3, and it might be a borderline case between the foundational philosophy and implicational philosophy. Both dimensions of philosophy of psychology are equally important, but this book is more focused on implicational philosophy of psychology than foundational philosophy of psychology. There are two reasons for this. First, implicational issues have recently stimulated very lively discussions in philosophy of psychology research, which used to be dominated by foundational issues. We wanted this book to reflect this recent trend. Second, existing philosophy of psychology textbooks mainly focus on foundational issues, leaving the implications largely unexplored. This book is motivated by our frustration with the lack of accessible resources for discussing implicational issues. Hereafter, philosophy of psychology means implicational philosophy of psychology. This book will focus on implicational issues rather than foundational issues. However, strictly speaking, its focus is even narrower. There are so many interesting implicational issues, and one book is not able to cover them all. As hinted previously, we will prioritize topics related to the imperfection of human cognition and agency. Our essential topics will include reasoning, judgment, belief, emotion, behavior, and agency. For this reason, unfortunately, we will largely ignore the issues concerning consciousness, perception, attention, and so on. That's devastating. Was I not misled? I could have sworn I had a justified expectation that consciousness would be discussed. No, it's not justified. Okay. My bad. All right. No worries at all. No worries at all. Gonna have further resources for some, see further resources for some material on the issues that we do not discuss in this book. So why do we need philosophy of psychology? Why do we need philosophy of psychology in addition to metaphysical philosophy of mind and psychology as distinct disciplines? Why can't philosophers confine themselves to purely metaphysical issues? Why can't psychologists confine themselves to purely empirical investigations? There has been no sharp distinction between philosophy and psychology in Western intellectual history. Many philosophers who talk about mind and cognition in the history of philosophy go beyond the field of philosophy of mind in a narrow sense and touch on issues that now belong to the field of psychology. For example, Plato's tripartite theory of soul, according to which the soul is divided into reason, spirit, and appetite. No, sorry, I shouldn't laugh. How could he? Yeah, great job, Plato. And that's in The Republic. We have also Descartes' physiological analysis of various emotions in Passions of the Soul. We have Hume's associationist psychology in A Treatise of Human Nature. We have Kant's classification of mental disorders in Essay on the Maladies of the Head, and so on. The sharp distinction between philosophy and psychology is a modern development, mainly due to the specialization of each field. The advancement of research in each field obliged some researchers to focus on the metaphysical issues of the mind and other researchers to dedicate themselves to empirical investigations instead. This is an inevitable and perhaps good development overall, but it invites a potential problem. Many of the fundamental questions about human nature require philosophical argumentation as well as empirical inputs. Also, one thing that pops in my mind is what's frustrating to me is that we haven't kind of started from scratch with some things. So all these philosophers did all this work in psychology, right? Came up with all these words, reason, emotion, and so on, and all these kind of schema, or reason versus emotion, and so on. And a lot of those, I think, have just been taken for granted by research psychologists, and they're like, oh yeah, now let's figure out where this divide is between reason and emotion, or let's take for granted that there is a system of reason, and whatever. Suppose that you are interested in whether humans have some property X, such as the property of being rational or the property of being altruistic. To answer this, you need to investigate two sets of questions. One, what does it mean to have X? What is necessary for a person to have X? And what is sufficient for a person to have X? And our second set, two, do humans satisfy a sufficient condition for having X? Do humans fail to satisfy a necessary condition for having X? And what do empirical studies say about these things? Let us call the former the philosophical questions about X and the latter the psychological questions about X. Great, yeah. Great. Um, okay, addressing the philosophical questions requires the articulation. Oh, by the way, we're going to be. Oh, no, not lucky. We'll be able to. All right, so we're just going to be reading the introduction. Okay? You okay with that? Who was that? Neo? Don't do it. Addressing the philosophical questions requires the articulation and justification of certain controversial claims, such as being rational means reasoning in accordance with the rules of logic and mathematics, or being altruistic means being motivated to increase somebody else's well being for its own sake. Right, exactly. Yes, great. Obviously, they were going to do that, so I don't know why I'm so excited. Great. Addressing the psychological questions requires setting up. Addressing the psychological questions requires setting up definitions, and then studies. Okay, so addressing the psychological questions requires setting up laboratory experiments and observations in the wild, where human behavior is assessed on the basis of the criteria for rationality or altruism, such as measuring how many people out of 100 commit a logical fallacy in a simple test, and how many people out of 100 act in a selfless way given the chance. The reason you can't just let philosophers do what they do is that although a purely philosophical investigation is useful for addressing the philosophical questions, it does not say much about the psychological questions. For instance, a philosophical argument does not say anything about whether, as a matter of fact, humans can be motivated to increase somebody else's well being for its own sake. You trying to go outside? All right, fine. Now, where are you? You're chilling. Okie dokie. Um, no, let's have it. All right, well, at least stop. Okay, so a philosophical argument does not say anything about whether, as a matter of fact, humans can be motivated to increase somebody else's well-being for its own sake. In contrast, the reason you can't just let psychologists do what they do is that although a purely psychological investigation is useful for addressing the psychological questions, it does not say much about the philosophical questions. For example, a psychological experiment does not say anything about whether rationality should be regarded as the capacity for reasoning in accordance with the rules of logic and mathematics. Let us think. So, I often say philosophy is nothing without science. Um, I'm convinced otherwise. Um, that yeah, they each play their part, but they need each other. Um, so I guess we can say, but can we say science is nothing without philosophy? Hmm. I don't think so. It's dangerous, maybe. Let us think about a further example, which we will discuss which we discuss in detail in chapter 6. Suppose that you want to know whether humans have free will and responsibility, according to relevant psychological findings. To know this, you need to investigate both the philosophical and the psychological questions. What does it mean to have free will? What is necessary for a person to have free will? What is sufficient for a person to have free will? And then the other set, the psychological set, do humans satisfy a condition sufficient condition for having free will? Or do humans fail to satisfy a necessary condition for having free will? And then what do empirical studies say about these issues? That's just so funny that it comes after, because it's like how it, never mind. Well, it's just like in order to answer that, you have to look at the empirical studies. So I don't know. A purely philosophical investigation can address the philosophical questions, but not the psychological questions. For example, one might argue for some yeah, come on. One might argue for some philosophical reasons that it is necessary for person A to have free will, that A's for example, one might argue for some philosophical reasons that it is necessary for person A to have free will, that A's conscious mental states and processes play some significant causal role in producing or controlling A's behavior. Okay, one more time. For example, one might argue, for some philosophical reasons, that it is necessary for person A to have free will, that A's conscious mental states and processes play some significant causal role in producing or controlling A's behavior. And if we say that, then obviously we don't have free will because consciousness is experience. It's awareness, as my dad says over and over again. Um, and then stop. No more. That's it. This is certainly a possible answer to a philosophical question, but we need to know more to ascertain whether humans have free will. In particular, the psychological questions have not been answered yet. It is still unclear whether, according to relevant empirical studies, conscious states and processes in human cognition play the right kind of causal roles. Yeah, so let me qualify what I said with based on what I've seen anyway so far. As we shall see in chapter 6, this is the topic of a recent interdisciplinary debate on free will. A purely psychological investigation can address the psychological questions, but not the philosophical questions. I do just want to make sure I'm I'm streaming. How do I... Ooh, new achievement, 75,000 views. Ooh, gained a subscriber, 259 subscribers. Looks like your videos are getting more attention. Wow. All right, let's go to content, live. Why does it say starting? Why does it say starting? Oh, no, it's good. Why does it say starting? Awesome. Okay, great. Oh, no, it's good. It started. Awesome. Okay, great. Okay, great, excellent. So relieved to know that I am live, but I still only have one comment. Mama's busy. All right, in particular, so as we shall see in chapter 6, this is the topic of a recent interdisciplinary debate on free will. Just in case you forgot, I know I said it several times over, we're only on page 10, but a purely psychological investigation can address the psychological questions but not the philosophical questions. For example, psychological studies might suggest that Elsa's discriminatory behavior is generated by her implicit biases, which can only be detected by psychological tests. Elsa is not introspectively aware of her biases. This is certainly an interesting finding, but we need to know more to judge whether she is responsible for her discriminatory behavior. I mean, of course she is. What? Like, whether she is generating it, whether she should be blamed for it, or just like whether she's the person who needs to, do something about it, go do some training like every other person in the universe. Like me, like you, we all need to do some training. And it's crazy that we think we exist in the modern era. I mean, obviously we do, relatively speaking, but God, the future is going to be just so different, of course. And obviously there are going to be things that you can be like, how the fuck do we not have that? Such as teaching psychology in primary school and having any, people go through um, bias training, racial sensitivity, whatever, you know? Okay. Gender, whatever, all that's training. Um, Elsa is not introspectively aware of her biases. This is certainly an interesting finding, but we need to know more to judge whether she is responsible for her discriminatory behavior. In particular, the philosophical questions have not yet been addressed. It is still unclear whether Elsa's lack of introspective awareness of her implicit biases is incompatible with her being responsible for her discriminatory behavior. Oh, let me tell you, it is not. As we shall see in chapter 6, this is the topic of a recent discussion about whether people are responsible for their implicit biases. Section Evaluating Psychological Studies. This book focuses on implicational philosophy of psychology, investigating the implications of some particular psychological studies. Before getting into our main discussions, we would like to mention 3 factors that are relevant in the context of evaluating psychological studies and their implications: replication, research participants, and ecological validity. What's that mean? Replication. Psychological studies, just like other scientific studies, need to be replicated in order to be credible. It is possible that some interesting results fail to be replicated. In fact, psychology, social psychology in particular, is now facing the so-called replication crisis. The replicability of social psychological studies, including some famous ones, seems to be remarkably low. A recent controversy, for example, is about a series of studies of priming effects by John Barr and colleagues. Priming effects are the unconscious effects that the exposure to a stimulus has on the responses to subsequent stimuli. Yeah, okay. I was gonna say, I was gonna give you the example of the Florida effect, but that's what they're about to do. One famous study, which has which has over 5,500 citations on Google Scholar as of October 2020, reports the surprising results that the participants who had completed the simple task of making a sentence out of some given words, including words related to stereotypes of the elderly, e.g., gray, wise, or wrinkle, walked away more slowly than other participants who had completed the same task without elderly related words. However, several researchers reported their failure to replicate the elderly stereotype study and suggested that the popularity of priming studies by Barr and colleagues is disproportional to their scientific credibility. Daniel Kahneman, who had once mentioned the elderly stereotype study in his best selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow, admitted that he had placed too much faith in underpowered studies in response to a blog post on the controversy. The problem is compounded by the fact that replication failure tends not to be reported in journals, unless, just like in the case of priming studies by Barg and colleagues, a serious controversy arises. Paul Bloom says that when the project of replicating a study turns out to be unsuccessful, usually the project is just abandoned, though sometimes the word gets out in an informal way in seminars, lab meetings, conferences, that some findings are vaporware. Well, nobody can replicate that one. And many psychologists now have an attitude that if a finding seems really implausible, okay, this is not something said at seminars. This is like the previous quote, okay? And many psychologists now have an attitude that if a finding seems really implausible, just wait a while and it will go away. We do not necessarily endorse radical pessimism about social psychology. After all, many important studies have been replicated. But as a general rule, replication should always be kept in mind when evaluating psychological studies, and perhaps some extra care is needed when evaluating studies in social psychology with surprising results. Okay, completely unrelated. I was just thinking about my partner, Sarah, and she isn't here. Um, and well, I guess it doesn't matter why I was thinking I wish she was here. Um, so how much money does it cost, a country, um, in GDP of its GDP, divorce or even just like breakups, and so on. Or let's say divorce for now. Probably a significant amount. Okay. Can't get any more specific than that. Significant, I'd say. Probably, right? Okay. So would it be worth it if you could have a romantic leave? Not for the divorce. When you feel like you've identified someone and you're like, I think that this person could, hey, fishing god, that's funny. I had a new subscriber, fishing lover. Probably you, right? Hello. Um, what if you could go on what would be called like a romance leave or something, and then you just like spend, let's say it's like, I don't know, 2 months, and you can get, you can't do that every year. There's some limit to it, and then during those 2 months, you and your partner both go on romance leave and just really like get to know each other. You just spend all your time together to kind of speed up the discovery of problems. Um, oh, but then it would be kind of be often, wouldn't it? Because then you discover problems, so then you go find another partner. You're like, oh, this one might be good. I want to go on romance leave again. Huh. Well, anyway, I still think it's something that could be good for us in the future. Um, especially these days, right? People are like meeting in their 20s and 30s when they're, also busy with their careers, and so they can be dating and kind of barely see each other. Um, anyway, it's interesting, isn't it? Romance leave. Okay. So we're talking about replication, which is one of the three factors that are relevant in the context of evaluating psychological studies and their implications. So we do not necessarily endorse radical pessimism about social psychology have been replicated. But as a general rule, replication should always be kept in mind when evaluating psychological studies, and perhaps some extra care is needed when evaluating studies in social psychology that have surprising results. Replication really matters. But what about the observations of rare conditions about which we cannot expect statistical analysis of data or replication? Despite the lack of statistical analysis or replication, the study of some unusual behaviors can be informative and can help us to understand how the mind works. In the book Phantoms in the Brain, so Ramachandran, by the way, to everybody, I recommend A Brief Tour of Human Consciousness by the author he's about to talk about, V.S. Ramachandran. And so actually what I recommend is a book of me driving, no, a video of me driving from Brittany, or the northwest region of France, to Paris. And in that video, I read the whole book. It's like 6 hours and 54 minutes. I do a lot of talking about it, but I read the whole book, and he talks a lot about he talks about this point and just a lot of really valuable things. I think it's maybe the best introduction that I can think of to psychology and neuroscience, and it's like 150 pages. Okay. So despite the lack of statistical analysis or replication, the study of some unusual behaviors can be informative and can help us to understand how the mind works. In the book Phantoms in the Brain, V.S. Ramachandran defends the usefulness of observing rare cases as opposed to the statistical study of normal individuals. In neurology, this is a quote by Ramachandran. In neurology, most of the major discoveries that have withstood the test of time were, in fact, based initially on single studies and demonstrations. More was learned about memory from a few days of studying a patient called HM than was gleaned from previous decades of research averaging data on many subjects. The same thing can be said about hemispheric specialization, organization of the brain into a left brain and a right brain, which are specialized for different functions, and the experiments carried out on two patients with so-called split brains in whom the left and right hemispheres were disconnected by cutting the fibers between them. We agree with Ramachandran, especially with this idea that we can gain useful insights by observing some rare cases. This is why we will include the split brain cases, which Ramachandran mentions in this passage, in our discussion of self-knowledge in Chapter 2, and Capgras syndrome, which is a rare condition that Ramachandran discusses in his book. Okay, he discusses in Phantoms in the Brain, but he also discusses it in A Brief Tour of Human Consciousness. And so to find that video, you go to my playlist, A Brief Tour of Human Consciousness, and it should be like the only video in there. Or maybe it's BTHC is the playlist name, I don't know. Which is a rare condition. And Capgras syndrome, which is a rare condition that Ramachandran discusses in his book, in our exploration of delusion in Chapter 7. Ramachandran's idea is also perfectly compatible with the importance of statistical analysis and replication when it comes to the phase in which we test the insights that we initially gain in observing rare cases. Ramachandran's idea is also perfectly compatible with the importance of statistical analysis and replication when it comes to the phase in which we test the insights that we initially gain in observing rare cases. In fact, he only says that major discoveries in neurology were initially based on single studies and demonstrations. His recommendation is to begin with experiments on single cases and then to confirm the findings through studies of additional patients. Section, research participants. So this is the second factor that needs to be taken into consideration when evaluating psychological studies. Psychological experiments need human participants. Typically, the participants of psychological studies are university students because these are the most easily accessible kind of people for psychology researchers. But this can be a problem. In psychology, we are not just interested in finding out how the mind of a university student works. Rather, we are interested in finding out how the mind works in general. Can we learn about how the mind works in general from psychological studies involving only university students? Uncritical optimism on this issue has been questioned in recent years. It has been suggested that most psychological studies published in major journals rely on the participants in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, weird is the acronym for that, we've come across before on the channel, societies, who are in fact highly unusual in many psychological aspects. Passage. People from Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, weird societies, and particularly American undergraduates, are some of the most psychologically unusual people on earth. So the fact that the vast majority of studies use weird participants presents a challenge to the understanding of human psychology and behavior. Strange, then, that research articles routinely assume that their results are broadly representative, rarely adding even a cautionary footnote on how far their findings can be generalized. We will come back to this problem in Chapter 4 when discussing cross-cultural studies of moral judgments. Ecological validity. Ecological validity. Many psychological studies are undertaken in some artificial situations that are not representative of everyday settings. I see. And the tasks proposed in the laboratory may not have the same relevant features as everyday tasks. This raises a methodological problem. In psychology, we are not just interested in understanding how people think and behave in artificial tasks and settings. Rather, we are interested in understanding how people think and behave in everyday tasks and settings. Can we learn about how people think and behave in everyday tasks and settings from the psychological studies involving only artificial tasks and settings? Bloom warns us against the tendency to conclude. Bloom warns us against the tendency to conclude that human agents are irrational on the basis of the experimental findings of irrational biases and errors in artificial tasks and settings. Perhaps biases and errors are exaggerated in artificial settings. They might not be very significant in real life cases. Sorry, Paul Bloom, have you never left your lab? Serious question to Paul Bloom. Is your lab under a rock? Because I'm out here in these streets and I can tell you that what does it say? That the biases and errors are um like major and the arrogance in the thinking system, despite the thinking system that has those biases and errors, is, I think, the leading cause of death. I think almost every cause of death, I won't say almost every, I think the majority of causes of death can fall under our ignorance and arrogance about our biases and errors. Now, might it be exaggerated in artificial settings? Maybe, but it's just like it's so significant that. All right, anyway, let's read this passage from Paul Bloom. All right, I'm done, Abbott. You're coming inside. Wait, wait. All right, so all right, we got to go. Okay, let's go. So from Paul Bloom, statistically significant doesn't mean actually significant. Just because something has an effect in a controlled situation doesn't mean that it's important in real life. It is under a rock. Your lab is under a rock, isn't it? Your impression of a resume might be subtly affected by its being presented to you on a heavy clipboard, and this tells us something about how we draw inferences from physical experience when making social evaluations. Very interesting stuff, but this doesn't imply that your real world judgments of job candidates have much to do with what you're holding when you make those judgments. What will actually matter much more are such boringly relevant considerations as the candidate's experience and qualification. What should our name be for people who, like psychologists, cognitive neuroscientists, who are just so committed, are so self-serving, are so human-serving? Not in the sense of trying to provide service, but in the sense of, like the self-serving bias of, trying to see, or not trying to, but just seeing, despite evidence, very favorably humans, or seeing them as our intuition suggests they are. I don't know. And I don't have time. Great. Oh, great. We're done. I gotta go. Okay, this is something we should keep in mind, especially when we explore the limitations of human cognition. It is conceivable that the limitation that is found in a controlled experiment does not have much impact in real life. Sure, it's conceivable until you look around. So some further resources. Am I gonna read this out loud? Nah, probably not. All the sources are, there's one in 2018, one in 2019. Everything else is 2015 and before. Questions. All right, I guess that's stupid because it's not like we've learned. No, I don't know. Kind of a quickly moving field. So some questions to wrap up the chapter introduction. One, how can philosophy and psychology profitably interact in understanding how the human mind works? Two, can you think of some particular examples in which philosophers and psychologists profitably interact with one another? These questions haven't slapped any answers from me yet. What can philosophers learn from psychological studies? What can psychologists learn from philosophical arguments and discussions? I mean, these are big questions, huh? I'm not even sure yeah. I don't think this is the type of question you can, like, answer. I don't know. Is there a clear boundary between philosophical discussion of the mind and psychological discussion of it? Or is the boundary inevitably vague? And there you go, buddy. So, next tomorrow, you're going to read rationality and probably also self knowledge. So, it's big day. Big, big day. Because we have to finish this. Um, in the next week. That's it. That's all I have to say. Okay, excellent. All right, see you tomorrow, gang.